Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming and welcome to this seminar on integrating trade and decent work with a focus on what works and why. A very practical title. Our other job this afternoon is to launch two publications on integrating trade and decent work. These publications were created as part of the project on supportive domestic policies for better social, labour market and sustainable enterprise outcomes, with the acronym of SUPPORT. And this project is funded by the government of Flanders in Belgium. Let us start with some opening remarks. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Richard Samans, who is Head of Research at ILO. Richard.
Many thanks, and welcome everyone to our very new auditorium here. You are among the very first people to participate in this venue, and it's for a very auspicious conversation on integrating trade and decent work. One of the pleasures that I have as a director of our research department is to oversee what has been a several-year body of work to develop very practical approaches to address one of the issues that I would venture to say almost every government and society is facing in the world today, which is how to develop a more integrated and more effective approach to ensuring that the things that help to stimulate growth, trade being one of those vehicles, does so in a manner that is as socially inclusive and societally sustainable as possible. And that's what this body of work that's been supported for the last a few years by the government of Flanders has been seeking to do. My colleague Marva Coulibaly on my left, who will be helping to lead the discussion, has been overseeing this work. We'll tell you about it in further detail. But let me just give you a little bit of context for the discussion today. Almost a half a year ago, the ILO held as part of its annual International Labor Conference. It's, if you will, a global parliament of labor in engaging governmental and social partner representatives, a summit within that summit called the World of Work Summit, Social Justice for All. And there were a number of specific thematic discussions organized during that summit to take a look at different aspects of the challenge of advancing social inclusion and elevating a priority to be placed on social justice. And that particular session was on the vital social dimensions of trade. And we had, among others, the Director General of the WTO here for that conversation, and it was a tripartite conversation. And in that conversation, there was general agreement that trade is a constructive way forward to try to stimulate added growth and opportunity in countries. It improves the allocative efficiency with respect to resources in an economy. But at the same time, there was very strong agreement that much more needed to be done and in more creative ways to try to achieve a more equitable distribution of the benefits of trade and economic integration more generally for workers, firms, communities going forward. And that the international community and indeed national governments more generally needed to give some serious thoughts about how to improve the policy model in this regard. So that's the point of departure for this piece of work. There are many different ways different parties, including different organizations, are working on this challenge today. I would just note by way of passing that earlier today, the European Commission convened a group of interested governments, ambassadors, on the margins, I guess you would say, of the WTO to have a discussion about this topic. And I in that meeting, where there was fundamental agreement about those 2 points, that trade was a promising avenue for improving economic outcomes, but it was not sufficient. It might be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient, and that there's a need for much stronger institutional investment made in various dimensions of economic policy, not least labor markets and social protection systems, the areas that the ILO concentrates on quite heavily. And this afternoon, we're going to have a more specific discussion about that. So notably, our cooperation over the last couple of years has supported the development of a variety of policy tools and capacity building activities, including the Labor Provisions and Trade Agreements Hub, which is a novel tool for analyzing not only the text, but also the related activities of labor provisions in FTAs. Also, the project has supported training activities on trade investment and decent work. And we've also established a tripartite advisory committee to facilitate cross-regional engagement on these issues. Another important facet of the trade and decent work activity of the research department concerns the challenge of assessing the effects of trade on the labor market so as to benefit a wider range of workers and enterprises. We've developed a comprehensive framework, which will be presented shortly, which not only enhances our understanding, but also provides actionable steps to align trade and labor market policies for the attainment of decent work outcomes. The framework also does a number of other things. It employs the ILO's decent work indicators to conduct reasonably deep assessments of how trade influences the labor market across different levels. It delves into the intricate dynamics of labor market institutions and the essential labor market policies, and explores how they can help to maximize the positive impacts of trade while mitigating adverse effects. Finally, it also analyzes how labor issues are currently reflected in trade and investment policies and explores their potential to address decent work challenges in practice, including through a number of case studies. As I said, you'll be hearing more about this in due course. And although the framework that we're going to be discussing today, these methodologies for getting a better understanding ex ante of the potential labor market implications of trade opening, of deeper integration, either regionally or globally, it has played this type of an effort is very much consistent with a role that the ILO has assumed for many, many years, going back to the framing of its constitution and many of the conventions that it has developed over the years has, explicitly been about trying to ensure that expanded international economic integration leads to decent work, more decent work, higher quality of work, and the like. We are here in the ILO building our work based on a mandate that was provided by our governing body and indeed the entire International Labor Conference that I referred to earlier, set down in its centenary declaration in 2019. And that declaration at a top level framed the challenge as trying to find a more human-centered approach to economic policy more generally, and that this requires deeper investment in a number of areas of what has traditionally been considered domestic economic policy, not least labor institutions and social protection institutions. This human-centered approach is underlying, I think, the kind of work that we're trying to do here to find a better way to capture synergies and certainly to mitigate some of the potential downsides of trade on the one hand and labor market impacts on the other. So I want to thank Marva, you and the team for preparing the work that we're now going to describe. And I look forward to a meaningful exchange of ideas here today. And certainly want to thank you, Katrien, for the support that the government of Flanders has provided. As I said to you just a moment ago, I really do believe that this has been very forward-looking on your part, because this is an issue that remains, I think, a difficult one for many, many governments as well as stakeholders around the world. And we're quite hopeful and optimistic that the methodologies we've been developing can be of practical use. Thanks very much.
Richard, thank you very much. And let me now pass the floor to Katrien de Pauw, who is Acting General Representative of the Delegation of Flanders at the Permanent Mission of Belgium to the UN here in Geneva.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends at the ILO, it's since 1991 that Flanders fosters a robust relation with ILO. And it's marking it as one of our earliest and most significant partnerships we have with multilateral organizations. Our collaboration began through the International Training Center in Turin, evolving in 2001 with the establishment of a Flemish trust fund for ILO, and in 2016 with a formal partnership agreement, streamlining and enhancing our joint efforts. So it's with pleasure I can say that Flanders and the ILO go way back. Flanders pursues an ambitious, modern and assertive trade and investment policy that contributes to sustainable economic growth. We firmly believe that trade policy can be an important lever for such growth. And therefore, when negotiating free trade agreements, we strive for robust chapters on trade and sustainable development, the so-called TSD chapters. Additionally, we emphasize the imperative of promoting decent work within international supply chains and encouraging corporate social responsibilities among Flemish businesses. It's also therefore that Flanders supported ILO's activities on trade and decent work, and specifically the support project, as it contributes to sustainable development by aligning trade policies and domestic labor market institutions. We take pride in our contribution to establishing the Labor Provisions Hub in trade agreements. This hub provides trade experts and practitioners with comprehensive insight and an overview of best practices. Not only does it entail a wealth of information, I must say the tool also looks flashy and it's easy to use. So congratulations to everyone involved. Also, my colleagues, the trade experts in the Flemish Ministry, have already incorporated this Labor Provisions Hub and the insights it provides in their day-to-day work. And hopefully with them, many other trade experts find the way to this website. When you open the homepage of the hub and you start hovering over the blue map with your cursor, the screen instantly paints an interesting picture, because you see immediately how interconnected all states and regional blocs are within one another, and how many different trade relationships exist worldwide. This makes it all the more important to partner up and to work together through multilateral institutions like the ILO and the WTO. Because only on this level it will be possible to foster universal, predictable rules and standards, creating a stable, rules-based multilateral system in which to trade and to work. We're highly appreciative of the publications and research conducted by the ILO, backed by the Flemish financing, and we look forward to hear more during this seminar today. And I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the entire team and everyone involved for their valuable contribution and also for the organization of this seminar. Thank you.
And thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the second part of this afternoon, which is a presentation by the three authors of this publication on the contents. There are two volumes. The first volume is Has Trade Led to Better Jobs? Findings based on the ILO's Decent Work Indicators. And the second is The Potential of Trade and Investment Policies to Address Labour Market Issues in Supply Chains which, as Richard mentioned, are such an important part of global trade today. So now we're going to hear a little bit more about the findings and the outcomes from the three contributing authors to this publication. The first is Marva Corley-Kubiati, who is the senior economist and head of the Globalization, Competitiveness and Labour Standards Unit in the ILO's research department. Thank you, Marva. Online, we have their fellow author, Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid. He is professor at the Faculty of Economics at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Juan Carlos, I hope you can hear us and you are with us. Hopefully he will join us. And last but very much not least is Fatima Gul Unal, who is senior economist at UNCTAD, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So Marva, let me hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for the very, very nice introduction to the work that we've been doing in the team, as well as about the publication. And Katrien, if I had known such glowing remarks about the hub, I would have included you on the video that we did for the as a promotional tool. So I'm here this afternoon with two of the contributing authors, Juan Carlos Moreno Brid from Mexico, one of the academics, as well as Kozul-Wright from UNCTAD. And I think this composition of authors reflects very well the composition of authors who contributed to the overall publication. That includes technical experts from the ILO who are looking at labor in the context of trade-related changes. Also, technical experts from UNCTAD as well as WTO who are thinking about labor in the space of trade, so how trade and labor interact, and then the academics who are focused on more of an intersection between the two. There are over 18 chapters in this publication by more than 25 authors, and it goes through assessments as well as labor market policies and trade policies. This in my way. So, integrating trade and decent work, as someone said, is both timely and timeless. Timely for the reasons that Rick mentioned earlier. This is an issue that's at the very origins of the ILO, and it's an issue that we've been discussing and debating for quite some time. However, considering some of the transformational processes that we're currently seeing with respect to trade, technological changes, environmental changes that have been ushered in more rapidly as a result of COVID, not to mention some of the geopolitical considerations that have sparked more regionalization and in some sense protectionism as well. This has led to uncertainty, and this has implications for the future of work. The question is, how do we harness the benefits that we know very well that trade has while addressing some of the challenges that we see in the world of work with respect to rising inequality, job displacements, gender dynamics, as well as informality? And just to paint a very simple picture for you, we know that trade opening, there's a positive correlation between trade opening and GDP, but at the same time, we've seen wage stagnation over time. So why this publication and why now? What is our value added? Most of the international organizations in the past 6 years have come out with publications on trade and labor. Our approach is slightly different. Rather than starting from a trade-centered approach, where we would simply address the distributional effects of trade, we actually focus on a human-centered approach. And that's putting people at the center of trade, thinking about labor market policies from the very beginning. To do this, we use a mix of tools and technologies. We go beyond only employment and wages, and we think about work in terms and conditions. What is happening with respect to status of employment, with respect to child labor, forced labor, what's happening with respect to labor rights. We also consider the role of labor market and trade policies and programs more from a structural imbalance perspective, so that they can be dealt with before there's trade opening, during trade opening, and after the process. And how can they be integrated as well into trade policy? This figure here gives sort of this broad overview where labor market institutions and the policy needed to support them are at the center of policy. Our comprehensive assessments feed in to that labor market policy, which then can be used to deal with some of the structural imbalances before there is even trade opening. And this can inform trade investment policies. But let me start first with this comprehensive framework for assessments and share some of our key findings. There are 2 volumes to this publication. Volume 1 focuses mainly on the assessments as well as labor market policies. The findings, as you can imagine, across countries are quite diverse. We have 4 case studies, but there are some commonalities, and the commonalities generally revolve around gender issues. In terms of informality, We know that informality and exports tend to be positively associated. But at the same time, while firms engage in trade, they are more likely to lead to formalization of employment, specifically for women and other disadvantaged workers. However, and here's the key challenge, although it creates jobs for women, it doesn't necessarily mean there's an improvement in gender equality, either in terms of occupations. Women tend to be segmented at the lower tiers of supply chain. Even when they do have higher management positions, there's still a pay discrepancy between men and women. And even with respect to access to opportunities, with respect to training, we see gender disparities. So these are still pending issues and goals that countries have to reflect on and deal with in the context of trade. One interesting point we also found is that given their lower wages, women tend to be a competitive advantage for firms that participate in international trade. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague now, Juan Carlos Moreno Brid. I hope he's on the line in Mexico.
I am here, right next to you.
Thank you. Who can give a bit more detail on this in the context of the trade and decent work in Mexico and the manufacturing sector. Over to you, Juan Carlos.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you in particular and ILO in general for inviting me and my team in Mexico to work in this very exciting project. Usually one is invited to talk about trade and never to talk about work or value added. So trade and value added, that's okay, but decent work, that's a first in Mexico. And thank you, Marva. It's a pleasure. Now I've just spoiled 30 seconds of my 3 minutes, so here I go. First of all, why Mexico? Well, Mexico, besides being Mexico, Mexico is the poster child of trade liberalization, come the quest of export-led growth through market reforms. Since the mid-1980s up to today, the country put in place major reforms to give more room to the private sector than to the public one, to place trade as the handmaiden of growth. The crux was to open the economy to trade and finance and reduce the state's intervention in the economy that was thought to be only a creator of distortions. Exports soared as a percentage of GDP and manufacturers even more. We went from being an oil exporting country that 80% of our exports were oil to being a manufacturer exporting country with 80% of our exports now being manufacturers. And the gem of that export success was the auto industry. But unfortunately, the success has not, in the trade part, has not been accompanied by dynamic growth, not by a reduction of inequality, not to mention better jobs, and poverty is still horrendous. Labor poverty, informal employment, I mean, are very, very precarious. It's still a major deficiency of Mexico's social and economic performance. Albeit exports dynamics increase at, exports of manufacturers increase at 2-digit rates per year. The rest did not. So we have a case of success in exports, success in foreign direct investment, but no success in development. As Danny Roderick put it some years ago, actually, he said there's no country with such a stark contrast as Mexico between its external success and its domestic failure. Again, my brilliant research assistant, turn to the next slide, please, Marva. Thank you very much. I've never had such a colleague changing the slides. Thank you. Why the auto industry? The findings are, well, the findings are what Marva said initially, and the other colleague from the ILO. There was some progress, yes, but there was not a lot of progress as it says there. No, women are still very, very small part of the industry workforce. I'm talking about the auto industry. And working poverty and low wage have increased, unfortunately, while the share of higher income and permanent workers have shrunk. What we saw, this is a very oligopolistic industry. It's actually made of American firms in general, some European ones and a few Asian ones. But what we didn't see any real improvement. I mean, the slide looks great because it looks with green, green Nike type of marks, and that looks like a lot of improvement. But we didn't see improvement, anything to brag, anything to write home about in terms of better work, decent work in the Mexican auto industry, not to mention in Mexico in general. Can we turn to the next slide, Marva? decent work should be a priority of the development agenda. Yes, initially in the inauguration, someone mentioned whether trade policy can help. Yes, it can certainly help. But I would say that what happens is a bit with trade policy, as with any other policy. Let me quote John Donne on "No Man is an Island." No policy is an island entirely of itself. Every policy is a part of the continent, a part of the main agenda of development. And in that sense, what happened in Mexico, in the auto industry and in general with trade policy, as we went from a very state-led industrialization efforts and to a trade lib approach, what we did when we applied this trade liberalization approach, which, I mean, the auto industry blossomed in their first type of agenda with industry, state-led industrialization. I mean, regulations. We managed to make the American firms modernize their whole plants in Mexico to make them competitive in order to be able to sell in Mexico, where we're a very, very dynamic domestic market. And then with NAFTA, again, we managed to give another boost to the auto industry side, but that didn't bring better back or stronger backward linkages or forward linkages or better employment. The unfortunate thing, or the very, very bad policy mistake, was that we launched this very interesting trade policy, but we forgot about industrial policy. We forgot about employment policy, about public investment. So at the end, we just had this policy that, okay, it improved exports, and actually it improved exports in not in value added, but much more in gross output. So we ended up being now in a case where we have like an economy in a dual situation where a few very large firms are very, very successful, particularly in the auto industry, penetrating export markets, but in the rest of the economy is not in such situation. Now we have a USMCA agreement with a revamp of NAFTA, and the great thing of that USMCA agreement is that it includes a very, very strict negotiations or strict agreements to modernize our labor market situation or labor regulations. That is in total tandem with the new government, or well, that's not so new, with the current government approach to labor reform. So now we have, I'm very happy to be here with ILO. We have an ILO labor regulation, labor law environment in Mexico, which I do hope that we do see much more improvement in the decent work area, because this country needs it very much, and we're very grateful to ILO to help the Mexican government and us in particular to be able to share our knowledge with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos.
Thank you.
That leads very nicely into the next section of the report with respect to how trade policies are actually being used as an instrument to advance labor rights. And this was mainly the subject of most of the chapters in Volume 2. And we go through the designs of different trade policy instruments with respect to trying to understand what their impacts are, how they actually work, and what their effectiveness is in terms of bringing about decent work. We're really looking and we're really interested there in terms of the mechanisms through which they're able to have impact. The key findings from the two studies or from this volume are quite interesting, and it's in addition to some of the work that we've already been doing in this area. First, we know there is a growing use of trade policies and programs to adjust structural labor market challenges. We find this is even more so, and this goes back to the issue of women that we found with the assessments. This is even more so with respect to women. You find this in trade agreements, and here I'm referring to bilateral and plurilateral and regional trade agreements, specific actions and activities for trainings and skill development, as well as ways of addressing gender-based discrimination. You also find in the multilateral level, particularly in Aid for Trade, programs that also focus on gender discrimination in employment, as well as gender-based violence. What's interesting here, and I think it goes to the case of Mexico as well, is the role of domestic actors in bringing about labor market reforms. We found in most cases where you saw changes with respect to domestic labor laws, implementation of domestic labor laws, changes with respect to freedom of association. Although the trade agreements are the catalyst for reforms, there was already a great deal of pressure from domestic actors on the ground. So these trade agreements help to push change that may have already been taken place, but couldn't blossom to a further level. In this respect, it's one thing we point out is the importance of capacity building of domestic institutions in order to strengthen that dialogue, so that workers are able to have a stronger voice and are able to be better represented. So one of the other case studies, this is the second case study we'll talk about today, we have one more after this, was on labor provisions and trade agreements, exactly that topic, and the role of stakeholders in those trade agreements. We know, based on our wonderful labor provisions hub, that 1 out of 3 trade agreements that are reported to the WTO include labor provisions. We know a lot about the design. However, the implementation of these labor provisions is not always straightforward. So the purpose of the research that we did for this publication was to understand better how this actually works in practice, how stakeholders are engaged, and what happens in the case of a labor dispute. And some interesting findings from the case study are reflected here. We were really looking, when we said stakeholders, for the role of worker and employers representatives. And we found that they're engaged throughout the trade agreements, and they really have a strong role in both identifying what some of the labor challenges are on the ground and addressing those challenges. First, through monitoring and dialogue, and these are through specific committees, institutional mechanisms set up in the context of trade agreements. And over 90% of the trade agreements with these mechanisms have a specific role for workers and employers representatives in terms of providing their point of view, their perspective. You have also strong relations with respect to development cooperation, and development cooperation specifically for capacity building of trade unions as well. And then finally, a role in terms of dispute settlement, both monitoring labor conditions as well as filing submissions. And we know, in fact, that this has been a strong impetus for transnational dialogue. About 70%, 7 out of 10 submissions that are filed in the context of trade agreements are as a result of cross-border coalition of actors. And so what does this all mean from a policy perspective? First of all, it's important not only to engage with social partners in the context of trade agreements, but to engage with them early on and continuously because of the technical expertise that they have on the ground. Different types of structures are important. It's often an overlooked issue. The issue has mainly become one about setting up formal structures, but informal structures have been shown to be just as important for dialogue and also for promoting compliance with international labor standards. So putting the framework conditions in place so that there can be informal dialogue is important. Finally, with respect to cooperative mechanisms, which we've shown that have been quite important, it's essential to strengthen those mechanisms because they're the primary means for which you can have compliance with some of the issues that are brought forward in the agreement. On that note, I'm going to move over. We've talked about manufacturing, we've talked about automobile sector, and we've talked a lot about trade agreements. We're still going to talk about trade agreements a little bit more, but in the context of agriculture and trying to think about how the issue of sustainability of agricultural sector also involves decent work, because it's quite difficult to have sustainability, environmental sustainability without thinking about the livelihoods of farmers and workers in the agricultural sector. And that's something that Gul is going to talk about.
Thank you, Marwa, and thanks a lot to the ILO for integrating us to this really very important work. As you may or may not know, UNCTAD will focuses on the multilateral system and policy space. So our study, more than maybe a country case study, is really a critical look to the framework where agriculture and trade intersects. So I'll start to say that there is no other sector that's more entangled than agricultural sector, because it really is the intersection of food security, labor, climate change, child labor, employment, and environmental sustainability, and of course, economic development, considering most of the developing countries are
have a very large rural base. Our paper has actually outlined, Marwa said that once I put the slides, then I can talk about anything. So our paper has outlined a couple of major issues to help detangle the sector. The biggest issue that we found is actually in the intersection of international trade and agriculture relates to the issue that relates to trade in general, which is international trade is seen as an end rather than as a means within a larger development framework. So as a result of this limited approach, most often policy design, both in agriculture and also international trade, really misses these crucial links between sectors of agriculture, industry, and also between economic activities of production and trade. So we argued that since 1980s, most agricultural policy interventions, including trade policy, made within the framework of the neoliberal paradigm, which really doesn't address structural issues in the markets, both domestic markets and international markets. And recently, discussion of food policy, food security, international trade relevant to agriculture predominantly really revolves around getting the harmonization of regulations or sanitary practices, so-called non-tariff measures. So one of the most dramatic manifestations of this failure, this approach's failure, has been evidence in the failed Doha rounds in 2001. When it was very clear that the agricultural subsidies were really preventing equal access to international markets via developing countries. And despite this failure, the lack of action from the developed world to eliminate subsidies is still a continuing debate within the green box subsidies. So one added maybe policy dimension to that ongoing debate within the international agricultural discussion is the addition of innovation and technology to fix the supply solution, which brings in itself another problem of just trying to fix the supply of food without regarding what's going to happen to the small farmers for producing this food. So, and another point that came out of our paper from the production side, the small farmer side, is that we try to lift the curtain that romanticizes small farmers as the savior entrepreneurs to the challenges of food security. Actual small farmers are the epitome of misery in the developing world. I want you to be a small farmer when you grow up, said no parent ever. Why? Because, if small farmers are so productive, why do they stay so small, right? It's because they do not have equal access to the markets, input markets, output markets, particularly, financial markets. They're left to the vagaries of the so-called free markets, and they're left to to trade with major corporations who are trading highly subsidized agricultural food and agricultural commodities from developed countries. So our paper, is want to outline that trade policies must address these imbalances in market access. Particularly land, credit markets, both at national and global levels. So providing small markets with entrepreneurial skills, education will not go far when the platform where they trade on is structurally completely imbalanced and they lose all their assets in the first financial crisis. So an interesting question at this point we wanted to ask was, that's actually my time up, but I'll just take a minute, that what are some of the common features of these failed trade policies? And the first one was that they look at agriculture as in a tangent. But maybe I should focus on what have been some of the good policies which succeeded. And most often they were trade agreements within South-South, within the developing countries with very similar development levels, and they had significant chapters on agriculture. They looked at trade not as an end in itself, but as a means to a larger development framework. They also didn't drop some of the developmental needs just to increase the trade volume. So in this chapter, hopefully which will give you more motivation to read, because I won't be able to detail all our findings. What we're proposing is really to use a conceptual framework that would recognize the differences and different levels in development among the developing countries and design both agricultural and international agricultural trade policies, and consider international trade really that I think may be the biggest failure, not really as just in, we were discussing about this morning, not in silos, just the agricultural sector or just international trade, but really as part of a much larger framework. Thank you. Sorry, I told that.
Thank you, Gul. And that brings the synopsis of the publication to the end. Maybe just a few concluding remarks to think about. There are other case studies in the report. I would encourage you to read it, and the website is there. We're continuing work in this area, specifically on the integration of different policies and thinking about the future, how this integrates with technology and environmental changes. And I think the work that Gul and UNCTAD are doing is really important in this respect. And maybe just to bring home the point about the importance of benchmarking decent work more generally in the context of trade, and how we can do that in a more comprehensive way, not only from an ILO perspective, but also from the perspective of different organizations. On that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Martha, thank you very much. And thank you also to your fellow two authors, Fatma Gul Unal and Juan Carlos Moreno Brid. So now we're going to move on to the third part of this afternoon's program, which is going to be a discussion panel. So if I could ask our 5 participants on the panel to go and make themselves comfortable in the hall and get ready to listen rather than to speak. And perhaps our panelists could come up and take their seats on the podium. We have just over an hour for the discussion session, and we will have time for some questions from you at the end. So please do make a note of anything that you want to follow up with our panel members, 6 of whom we have in the room and 1 of whom we have online, I hope. Let me start with a few introductions. First of all, we have Yuvan Bijavhur, who is Senior Advisor to the Director General of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Welcome. We have Celeste Drake, Deputy Director General of the ILO itself. Sonia Jahani from the Bahrain Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Richard Kozul-Wright, who is Director of UNCTAD's Division on Globalization and Development Strategies. Sarah Gabriela Luna Camacho, who is representative to the ILO from the Permanent Mission of Mexico to the UN office in Geneva. Jane Nalunga is Executive Director of Siatini in Uganda. Siatini is the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. That's an NGO that works to promote pro-development trade, fiscal and investment policies. I think that's correct. Thank you all very much. And online, I hope we have Alison Tate from the ITUC. She is Director of Economic and Social Policy. Alison, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you well. I hope you can hear me too.
Yes, we can. Thank you very much for joining us. Right, okay, let us start the questions with the home team. So Celeste, I'm going to address this one to you. Many people said that globalization and trade would spread wealth and bring better jobs to everybody, particularly in developing countries. There is a very strong feeling that that has not happened, that we've been let down. Why is that, do you think?
So let me start by saying trade has helped economies grow, created jobs, lifted millions of folks out of poverty, but it's also left a lot of people behind. And there's a lot of cases where it hasn't done that. And in some cases, it's because the policymakers who were negotiating the trade agreements were relying on economic models that did not account for how different workers, firms, and communities would encounter problems adapting to trade. So in many cases, the policies and the institutions that they needed to go along with the trade agreements or be included in the trade agreements just never materialized. So you had, for instance, in many developing countries, you had geographic immobility to prove stronger than they thought it would. So that gave you folks who were from communities that lost their economic base were not able to just easily move to a community that might be booming because of trade. So you had geographic mismatches, skills mismatches, and in many cases, workers ended up in lower skill, lower wage jobs than what they had before or dropped out of the labor market altogether. So it just, you didn't always have someone who lost a quality job go into a quality job, and you had a lack of robust policy response and strong labor market institutions that could have helped workers through freedom of association and collective bargaining create good, decent work out of low quality jobs. And developing countries likewise faced their own set of challenges in terms of geographic and skills mismatches. And although many of them saw a lot of new employment opportunities and folks entering the formal job market for the first time out of informality, you also saw a lot of these new jobs, as we heard on the last panel, remain at the lowest tier in global supply chains. And you didn't see this promise of moving up the supply chain. And even though women in particular were some of the beneficiaries of moving from informal to formal work, you still had, as Marva talked about, this discrepancy and discrimination against women where they didn't get the equality even when they moved up and had, you know, what they were told were the right skills. And social justice just requires us to make sure that when we talk about trade, that we are sharing the benefits both within the economy and between economies. And social dialogue and collective bargaining are amongst the tools that can promote decent work in that aspect. And secondly, that means we have to have other kinds of social guardrails as we increase trade. So when economic models do not account for the role of collective bargaining in turning jobs into decent work, or predicting how trade might differentially impact workers, firms, and communities, we have to put those guardrails in place. And we know that the results of trade on the world of work relied heavily on these institutional factors, including the quality of the labor market and social institutions. And so those have got to come into place now to make up for these decent work deficits that we're seeing. And once we have those, these social institutions and labor market policies can help both workers and enterprises, not only through transitional periods, but creating the right space for employers and workers to talk to each other and to their governments about how all can share in the benefits from trade. So given these considerations, it should not have been a surprise that the decision to open up markets without putting these institutions in place wasn't going to uniformly create decent work across the board. But it doesn't mean we don't have an opportunity now to utilize tripartism to build those links between trade and decent work and get it right going forward in the 21st century.
Okay, so social dialogue and social guardrails, and there's always room to learn from the past to improve the future. So now let me put that same question to WTO, the home of many trade rules. Jovan, what do you think went wrong, and what do you think can be done to make the future better than the past?
Thank you so much, Chair. So let me also commend all the colleagues on the floor and also the ILO for putting this seminar together. DDG Ellard unfortunately couldn't attend, so I'll just step in a little bit for Harold. It's big shoes to fill. But I think there's many things that have gone wrong, and it's not appropriate for the WTO staff secretariat to comment too much on what went wrong. But I think we all agree that development has been at different speeds and different processes for different members. If you just look at history, a lot of countries have been able to move beyond the poverty levels, have been able to build shared prosperity at a much faster rate than others. And there's many reasons to look at that. I think our former UNCTAD colleague can also weigh in extremely well. But I think one of them is obviously you've had countries that have been unable to catch up onto this train of globalization at the speed and scale needed, whether it be lack of robust trade policies, whether it be poverty, whether it be inflation. I mean, if you look at many developing countries in the 90s when the Marrakesh Agreement came together, a lot of them were and still are in debt distress and are extremely hit by now all these complexities of what we are calling the polycrisis of either conflict, of either fragility, of either climate change. The impacts of climate on developing countries are huge. I mean, myself, I'm come from a small island developing state. 7% of our GDP over the next 35 years is going to be lost just because of cyclones. So when you look at those polycrises, you look at the different levels of development and the speed at which some manage to enter global value chains, it's clear that environment was not necessarily optimal for everybody. So having said that, the Marrakesh Agreement of the WTO, which is established in 1995, really puts people and the planet at the center of our mandate and objectives. The Marrakesh preamble is all about sustainable development, jobs, sustainability, and people. So I think 30 years ago, I mean, just walking down the ILO corridor, you're seeing all these numbers of the ILO 100 years, right? So you're looking at where we're headed. I think there's tremendous opportunity for us to work together. And I think that's already happening from, 30 years ago, maybe the ILO and the WTO wouldn't be sitting on the same panel. But today we have that. It's almost impossible not to sit together and address these issues in a common way. On sustainability, I think there's huge opportunity. I mean, we're going to the COP in a few days. Africa is a powerhouse for building a number of the renewable energy and critical minerals. There's going to be a lot of jobs in those sectors. There's obviously the vision of the Director General herself of, as we fragment, as there's more fragmentation, and as those political divides become a bit more important, it's important for us to ensure that developing countries, SIDS, LLDCs, really are not left out. And so the Director General, Dr. Ngozi, has been pushing for a vision of reglobalization, that is deconcentrating supply chains from where they are. And we've seen through the pandemic that, a lot of lives were lost precisely because of unfortunate trade policies, preventing access, despite having all the money of the world to buy vaccines. A number of developing countries couldn't buy them because of trade policies. because of export restrictions and prohibitions. So when we look at sustainability, digitization, there's huge opportunity to ensure that developing countries enter those value chains. So that's what we are discussing at the WTO. We're looking at that in many forums through different initiatives that exist at the WTO. And I think the examples of this concentrated supply chains is a good one for us to look into. Of how do you build better jobs for tomorrow for developing countries and ensure that they're not left behind as bigger nations that are, the bulk of the trading system really trade more, perhaps more among themselves. As we see more friendshoring, more nearshoring, let's make sure that developing countries are part of that mix.
Thanks. Okay, I want to actually pick up on this issue of global supply chains, because I think it says in the publication that 70% of trade goes through global supply chains now. And I think this is an appropriate question to put to the third of the multilateral organizations on this panel, which is UNCTAD. And Richard, this is you. There was a lot of hope put into global supply chains in the last 30 years, as Yuval was saying. They haven't delivered. Prosperity has not trickled down through those global supply chains as we hoped. Do you think they can be restructured in a way that actually delivers on that promise?
I guess the answer to that is probably, but not necessarily. So thank you to the ILO for the invitation, including UNCTAD in this project. Nice to see Celeste outside of the Washington bubble. I think it's important to remember that supply chains are not a new feature of the global economy. Supply chains, structured international trade, particularly around commodities from the middle of the last century. You had simple supply chains in manufacturing from the late 19th, early 20th century. So they're not new. UNCTAD has been examining supply chains since we were set up in 1964, obviously mainly around the commodity question. And there are certain lessons, I guess, that I think are still relevant that we've taken from that examination. The first one is that simplistic ideas of comparative advantage as the way to understand and define the trade agenda are not necessarily a good way of understanding the costs and the benefits of international trade. And there are costs as well as benefits. I think that's important to keep in mind always. Specialization, which is a feature of the comparative advantage story, is an important source of gains, but diversification of the economy is just as important when it comes to benefiting from a healthy international trading system. And that's an important lesson that goes back to UNCTAD's early work. Corporate control shapes trade outcomes. People think countries trade with each other. Countries don't trade with each other. Firms fundamentally trade with each other. And in the classic story about commodities, very large international firms had pricing power. They had control of technology, all of which led to a very asymmetric relationships in the international trading system. So that was the importance of corporate control and understanding that relationship is key. Trade is not just a micro phenomenon, it's a macroeconomic phenomenon too. The balance of payments constraint is a major constraint on benefiting from trade, particularly if you're a developing country. Getting out of agricultural, informal labor markets, small, unproductive farms into more productive, more technologically sophisticated activities can very quickly run into balance of payments constraints because you can't export enough as you import, and that leads to potentially all kinds of problems. And that was a massive problem for developing countries in the post-war period. And finally, I think an obvious lesson, I think we've heard it already, linkages matter when you're looking to benefit from trade. You need to build a whole set of backward and forward linkages. You need linkages within your labor markets. You need to link up to the links between domestic and external markets are critical to benefiting. So those were kind of standard lessons that we had from looking at the early versions of supply chains around particularly commodity production. the promise, as you said, was that when supply chains extended in a big way to the manufacturing sector, which they did from the 1980s onwards, things would be different. That was the promise. And things would be different because supply chains were perceived as being easier for developing countries to begin building up industrial capacity. You didn't have to create the whole chain. You could start simply and then expand. And technology and the rules of the trading system were meant to facilitate that. Particularly a predictable rules-based system that reduced some of the risks for large enterprises to build capacity in developing countries. Secondly, FDI was seen as a package of, you didn't need to have linkages because the FDI would provide the linkages, technological linkages, marketing linkages, branding linkages would be provided by the lead firm that controlled the chains. And finally, these chains were expected to be more competitive, and therefore you'd have a lot of efficiency gains, which would lead to the trickle down that you talked about. Of course, the picture has been much more uneven and asymmetric, as you suggested, and for many of the same reasons that we were looking at back in the 1960s, to be honest, in terms of the way in which international trade is structured. Big lead firms have not eased their control of the assets that dictate trade performance. And in many respects, because finance has become such a much more important part of the global economy, the control of finance, of which lead firms, these big lead international firms, have buckets of, is a critical component in determining whether you benefit or don't from your participation in the value chain. Moreover, a lot of the decision-making in these chains has become very financialized. Big corporate firms operate as much like a financial institution as they do like a manufacturing institution. And we've seen that with their focus on liquidity and cash flow. We've seen that in terms of shareholder values and the need to create cash flow to pay dividends. We've seen it in kind of the dominance of quarterly earnings in terms of corporate capacity. So firms are as big as, in many respects, more powerful as ever. Governments are weaker. Policy space, as colleagues have already pointed out in their studies, has been squeezed. It's been squeezed partly for ideological reasons, as the shift towards neoliberal or Washington consensus kind of thinking has become dominant, and it's also because of trade agreements. Trade agreements have been designed to reduce the policy space available to developing countries. So as these large firms have grown, governments have become more squeezed, and that makes it more difficult to design the kinds of policies that are needed, particularly in developing countries, but not only in developing countries, to ensure that a kind of virtuous circle in which investment, profits, productivity, market expansion works in this way to give you the kind of trickle down the experience that you rightly point out was promised. And in many cases, there are exceptions that we should talk about, of which China is the biggest. But for most countries, that virtuous circle has not emerged as supply chains have spread across the developing world.
Okay, so the trickle down of standards, of technology, of rights simply has not happened. So, okay, so we've had three views from the level of the multinationals. I think it's a good moment to go and see what it looks like from the grassroots perspective. And Jane, I'm going to come to you. Let's get back to the basic question about this seminar, which is the link between trade and decent work, or what should be the link between trade and decent work. From what you see in Africa, from the work that you've done, what has worked and what has not worked?
Hey, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to share experiences from Africa, East Africa, and my country, Uganda, as regards what has worked, what hasn't worked, and why, when we talk about the link between trade and decent work. As has been pointed out, trade is critical to providing jobs, to reducing poverty, and also to leading to economic growth and sustainable development. In my region in Africa, what has happened, there has been a lot of regional integration processes, linking countries together, like the East African Community, COMESA, that's in Central and Eastern Africa, then SADC in Southern Africa. And now we're also having the Continental Free Trade Area. And the whole purpose is to increase trade. And I have seen trade increasing, especially in my region, in the East African region. And individual countries have also gone ahead to conclude agreements, initiatives like EU EBA. The European Union gave us everything but arms. So there has been increased exports, increased trade. But the link has not been positive. The increased trade hasn't led to decent work or productive unemployment. And I think we need to look at why a number of issues have been raised. For Africa in particular, the trade is in commodities mainly. We trade in commodities, in coffee, in cocoa, and we import finished products like chocolates and clothes and machinery, what Richard has pointed out, leading to a very high trade deficit. But it also leads to lack of employment, because we are at the bottom of the value chain in small-scale production. The previous speaker said nobody wants to be a small-scale producer, but that's where majority are based, because there are few industries. But even where jobs have been created, they are not decent jobs. There is a lot of casualization of labor. Most countries have no minimum wage. In my country, Uganda, the minimum wage was last revised in 1984. And by that time, it was $1.50, and that's what we have even up to today. So you find that even where there are formal employment, the working conditions are really bad. But I think we need to go back to recognize why the situation is the way it is. The issue of the neoliberal paradigm has been talked about. It's very, very critical, because that's the systemic issue. It's also ideological, which we need to address. The development paradigm, which gives more power to capital than labor, and also promotes private sector. In my country, talk about private sector-led development, and my president is the biggest champion of the private sector. In fact, his byline, leave my investors alone. So the power of the private sector has been reinforced by that very, very high unemployment. The employment is very high. For example, 64 to 70% of the youth are unemployed. So this gives a lot of power, to the investors, to the private sector, to be able to not to care about labor standards. And this is coupled with a poor and weak policies. The policies are weak, the investment policies, the trade policies, but also the capacity of the labor union. Although they are labor unions in Uganda, but they are very weak, because they can't be able to intervene on behalf of the workers. For example, we have members of parliament from the labor union, but they have even failed to push through the issue of a minimum wage. So in conclusion, I think it's because the issue of decent work is not at the center of trade policy. I see in my country, we glorify economic growth, GDP, we're exporting so many bags, but nobody talks about decent jobs which have been created. Even when we talk about jobs, we talk about, oh, there are so many jobs, but most of them are not decent jobs. So I think what's important is what has been talked about here, the human rights approach to trade policy. And I think that term also trickled down, also points to the fact that that people are not at the center, that things are done from the top and they have to trickle down. And by the time they trickle down, maybe there is nothing left for the people. So I think I will stop there. So those are experiences from my region, and the issue of decent work and trade is really, the link is still very tenuous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. So let me put that same question. Let's hop continents and go to Mexico. Links between trade and decent work. Why has it not worked, and what do you think we can do to make it better?
Thank you very much for the question and for the invitation. First, I want to say that for the ILO to invite in Mexico to be here in this panel. And congratulations to the authors of the publications that were presented before. I think they're quite relevant for the work that we're doing. I'm very glad personally as a representative of Mexico to see a strong gender perspective in those publications. And I hope they inform the policy making here in the ILO. And I was also very positively surprised about the case study of my own country, Mexico, and our experience as it was mentioned, we were the poster child of trade, but also it was true that there were other challenges in order to implement what we thought some years ago of opening to international markets will look like. So I think what hasn't worked has been addressed before me in the previous presentation. So now I'm going to focus on a very specific example of something that at least we think or we hope that it can work in terms of linking trade and decent work, or the decent work agenda. As you might be aware, we have a lot of trade agreements. We have a high rate of trade agreements as Mexico with different regions and countries. The most important, of course, would be the USMCA, the new agreement that substituted NAFTA back in the day. And that this one in particular now includes a labor chapter, this renegotiation that brought USMCA to life. And I have an expert here that maybe she can correct me if I say something that is not true or accurate. But this basically the reason behind it was that to recognize explicitly in a labor chapter in the USMCA between the North American countries, to recognize the fundamental principles and rights at work. And even before here in the ILO, we recognize OSHA, for instance, occupational safety and health as a fundamental principle. It was already reflected in the chapter in the UNFCA as part of the North America Trade Agreement. So the rationale there was precisely that, to link decent work with the supply chains in North America. These labor provisions, they do put labor rights at the center of trade issues. I've been hearing a lot about the human-centered approach. I think that was one of the main aspects of this chapter. And in the case of, and it even includes a compliance mechanisms to strengthen the applicable legal framework for the respect and protection of workers' rights. It was also mentioned in the presentation before. The trade union organizations now, they have of key industries in the supply chains in Mexico and the North America region, have access to another space where they can raise concerns and try to find solutions, very often through social dialogue in most cases. There's a mechanism, the creation of a panel and so on and so forth, but in the cases that have been put forward up until now, most of them have been resolved through social dialogue. That is something that was also highlighted in this conversation and before. So it also set that example on how social dialogue can work at the global supply chain level. So we believe at this point that we have succeeded a little bit on trying to put this in the center of the conversation of our biggest supply chain in the region. And for us, it is, and I think it was also mentioned before about the link between the national legal framework and the global framework. And for us, this is a very important case study probably for the future on how, for instance, in Mexico since 2019, that we embarked in a very high-level reform of the labor framework in Mexico that included a paradigm shift in the protection of labor rights and the administration of labor justice. I won't go into the details of that reform. It's quite broad and quite big and ambitious, but it has a lot of aspects that touch upon what we're discussing today. It has substantial changes in three main axes, namely freedom of association, collective bargaining, and the administration on labor justice, as I mentioned before. In short, by linking trade with the protection of labor rights, decent work is promoted in the workplaces of the countries that comprise it. It's a quite new approach, I have to say, but that's, I think, if something can be highlighted, is that we are aiming for these trade chapters to basically make a reality what we are seeing and what we will read in these publications, which is lifting people from poverty, promoting fundamental principles of the ILO, international labor standards, and hopefully have direct benefit to the population in Mexico and in the three countries, not only in Mexico. So I will stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And at this point, I'd like to bring in the ILO's social partners, the workers and employers organizations. And Alison Tate, let me start with you. Alison Tate from the ITUC. Alison, we heard a couple of minutes ago about the demands placed through supply chains through global investment on developing countries, return on investment, the need for quarterly profits, that kind of thing. Do you think that one of the problems we've got here is that there's too much emphasis on the needs and demands of investors and not enough emphasis on labor rights?
Thank you for the question, and I'm happy to build on what earlier people have spoken about, because I think the key response to that question is we need really clear rules, and we need investors to be abiding by those rules too. So what has already been said about the competitive floor, or what we used to call in the 1980s the race to the bottom, we still see those practices in place. So if we don't have investors looking to long-term returns, then we continue to have this race to the bottom. So we need to see that the aspects that have been described earlier in quite neutral terms, economic integration or comparative advantage, we know actually that, as earlier speakers have indicated, the lack of linkages to good public policy and coherence across macroeconomic policy, trade policy, linking fiscal policy and access to finance, industrial policy, really investing in job creation. We know that globalization has led to both job losses and job gains, but not fairly, and not with public policy in place to effectively anticipate those changes. So the ILO back in 2015, ahead of the Paris Agreement, we were able to, as constituents, employers, unions, and governments design a set of guidelines for decent work and just transition. It was specifically in the context of addressing climate action, but indeed can equally be applied to the context of digitalization and technological deployment. Companies don't think of only reducing carbon emissions. They're also looking at their responsibilities for returning a profit to their shareholders. So if we're really addressing the importance of labor rights, it's not only of the brands at the top of the chain or the suppliers at the bottom of the chain, or indeed beyond tier one in the global supply chain, but rather all actors need to take into account labor rights and the employment consequences of their investment decisions. So I think the language of an enabling environment for business is one that's been around for a long time. How about an enabling environment for decent work? How about taking into account labor rights and labor standards? And I just like to refer back to 15 years ago, when in 2008, the ILO member states, which are also WTO member states, promulgated the Declaration on Social Justice for a Fair Globalization. That declaration, and I just want to quote quickly, says that the violation of fundamental principles and rights at work cannot be invoked or otherwise used as a legitimate comparative advantage. Unfortunately, this remains the case. Weak labor laws, weak enforcement of those labor laws, and the proliferation of export processing zones or zones where labor laws are not even required to be applied in terms of domestic law, create opportunities for exploitation in order to both maintain and attract trade and investment. So as such, labor standards must be taken out of competition so that workers worldwide are guaranteed a global floor. And I'm sorry to say, this is something trade unions have been saying for decades. I repeat it again today.
Alison, thank you very much. So we should now get the employer's take on this. Sonia, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Less emphasis on investors and more emphasis on labor rights in global supply chains. Do you see that as a problem, or do you think that would be a good thing?
First of all, thank you so much. And it's an honor to be joining such an esteemed forum, and I sincerely apologize for not being able to be there in person. Today, I'm wearing two hats. I'm wearing the hat of the board member of the Bahrain Chamber of Commerce, and also the hat representing the International Organization of Employers at the same time. And jointly, we're talking about bringing and connecting together more than 50 million companies worldwide. And our focus today is primarily on our role is based on extending support and championing sustainable futures, guided by responsible trade and labor policies. You cannot basically do one without the other. You cannot exclude policies from investors or exclude investors from policies. And this is where the role of organizations, of chambers, and representatives of the International Organization of Employers champion the fact that they bring the two together and align the two together to ensure that you achieve your sustainable goals. The world is rapidly evolving. We can see many changes. I thank my colleague Jane today and the issues that she related to in terms of Uganda. I also refer to what my colleague Yvonne spoke about, the World Trade Organization. And to foster these changes and to ensure the sustainable development factor, we need to work together in a sort of an integrated way. We cannot work in silos individually. In fact, that cannot happen. We need to bring in all the constituents together, be it the government, be it the unions, be it the employers, to ensure that we have these policies done in the best possible ways to serve everybody and to ensure that we meet our goals. And we are today, as employer organizations, aligning our strategies and as countries aligning our strategies with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason is because we're not just focused on profit margins, but we are focused on what we can give back to the society. And this is why today organizations, big and small, are ensuring that corporate social responsibility is one of the main factors that they are involved in. And many of the companies today, being even small organizations, my company is a small organization in Bahrain, and today we focus on chocolate and we say we're creating chocolate for a better world. And why do we say that statement? It's because we needed to be healthy, we needed to have limited sugar, we needed to have limited cocoa butter, we need to ensure that we get our cocoa beans based on fair trade systems. And all these factors have been taken into perspective to ensure that we give back to the community, be it supporting the health, be it supporting the environment, be it supporting skills gaining, and how we've trained and developed our team to be working with us. And majority, I'm very proud to say, are women, to work with us starting from zero and understanding the basics and needs and skills of creating the best chocolate in the world. But the influence of trade policies on labor markets cannot also be understated. In a world where we are interconnected, trade policies have far-reached implications on labor standards and employment qualities. And as employers and business organizations, we have the power and responsibility to guide these policies towards inclusivity and fairness also. Additionally, innovation is the heart of sustainability, and we cannot neglect this point. And IOE members, as IOE members, we have always pioneered practices that not only champion environmental consciousness, but also drive long-term economic sustainability, because when you have economic sustainability, you can secure better job opportunities, and this is why both go parallel, hand in hand. I want to also relate here a bit about the IOE's initiative in 2021, the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment and Sustainable Development. And this coalition focuses on the efforts of employers and business member organizations of various sizes, small, micro, medium, large, and how they can advance employment growth and how sustainable development can be achieved through trade, but also focusing on it as being the main infrastructure and focusing on having its key objectives, including coordination between EBMOs and companies such as the WTO. It is very crucial, very important that we have regular dialogue, continuous dialogue between the WTO, the international trade entities, the business community, to ensure that these policies are aligned to the best advantage of all parties involved. Lastly, with respect to this intervention, I would like to present two case studies about Bahrain. And one of them is that Bahrain recently appointed a minister, Mrs. Noor Khlaif, as the Sustainable Development Minister, a lady taken on this role. And she has been involved in the Economic Development Board of Bahrain and focusing with the Economic Development Board of Bahrain on raising $1.1 billion in the next 3 years to create 6,000 quality jobs in Bahrain. And it's not just any jobs, quality jobs. She is involved in the Labor Market Regulatory Authority and works with governments and employers and unions to ensure that investors and labor rights are aligned while maintaining long-term sustainability goals in line with the Bahrain Vision 2030. Additionally, the government of Bahrain launched in 2020 the Economic Development Plan, which focuses on employing 20,000 Bahrainis in the economy and training 10,000 Bahrainis annually until 2024. So these are short-term goals that the government launches to ensure that it is achieved and to ensure that all the parties are involved. And this has been done through also a recovery plan scheme, and this was initiated primarily when we had the situation of COVID, because we did not want the country to face any disruption when it comes to creating quality jobs and ensuring that the team are efficiently trained and developed. And today I am very proud to say that the government has achieved, and we are in 2023, we have 1 year to finalize this goal, but more than 15,000 Bahrainis of the 20,000 expected have received the quality training, development, and job that they were expecting to receive. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you very much. Now, I do have a few more questions for the panel, but we only have about 25 minutes left of this session. So if I could ask you to keep your answers reasonably tight, that would be very, very helpful. And we might even be able to get in a couple of questions from the floor, which would always be excellent. Jane, I'd like to come back to you and ask you what you think about what you've heard about the idea of tweaking investment policies so that they deliver more on decent work. They emphasize more the components of decent work. Do you think that's realistic?
Thank you so much. It can be realistic if the investment policies have been crafted for that purpose. When you look at the investment policies, which most of them which are on the table, you see they have, there is an imbalance between the rights of the investors, on the other hand, the rights of even the state to regulate in public interest, even the rights of the workers, the rights of the environment. So basically, we need to balance that. And when you look at the policies, the investment policies which are in place, that balance is not there. We have done some work, the UNCTAD, the publications which are coming out when it comes to investment policies, showing us even when the bilateral investment treaties are coming to an end. And we have requested and encouraged our governments to be able to request for negotiating those agreements. But a number of countries have failed to do that because of the fear that if we request, for example, the Netherlands, that can we negotiate this agreement so that we can put in issues of, for example, of labor rights, they fear that maybe the investors will go away. But just 1 minute, there are changes now going on because of a lot of publicity on the human rights abuses. There is a move to review investment policies. And when you look at now the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, it has come up with a very good investment protocol, very good investment protocol. But now the challenge would be for national governments to be able to domesticate that investment protocol. Because for the first time, Africa has a protocol which talks about decent work, labor rights, ILO standards. So that's where we are. But I think ILO can be able to help countries to be able to domesticate the CFTA investment protocol, and it will be a very good beginning. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. Celeste, let me come back to you now. Jane was basically talking about some of the power imbalances between the different people involved in these deals. Do you think that the ILO, with its particular structure, has a strength in dealing with these kind of things?
I think we do, and I will give just a couple of examples to try and keep my answer short. But again, just to emphasize that the ILO as a tripartite organization can help actually build up these links between trade and decent work that can help safeguard workers, can help enhance the sustainability of firms, and can also make trade work for all. So one example of that is our Better Work program, which promotes decent work both in national supply chains and international supply chains. And the Better Work program has actually shown in very specific circumstances that it can produce higher take-home pay, shorter working hours, better work firms that actually are in compliance with all of the ILO core standards are more productive, and they're on average 25% more profitable. So it shows that decent work is not an impediment to trade, but actually enhances trade and makes it win-win. And just one other example, because we have heard about how trade policies should not be done in silos or in a vacuum, and there are these power imbalances. Another thing that the ILO does that can help start and enhance these conversations is our interaction with the G7 and the G20 and the BRICS, because we bring a perspective that, for instance, gets at Yvonne's question of why some countries weren't able to benefit from trade because they had, you know, all of this debt. And by the way, the IMF was often giving opposite advice to what the ILO was giving when we said, build up your social protections, because those will help workers and firms benefit from trade. The IMF was saying the opposite. So by being in, you know, the right conversations and saying, let's have coherent, integrated policies that actually promote decent work in every type of perspective, we can help build those linkages and help all workers in all countries benefit more from trade.
Thanks, Celeste. And Sarah, from the Mexican perspective, do you think the idea of getting labor more closely engaged in formulating trade agreements, do you think that would help?
Thank you very much. And I didn't apologize before for my voice. I hope people can understand me. Indeed, as I mentioned before in the previous question, we are truly convinced that this step that we took in the USMCA is leading us in the right direction. Then again, it's quite a new effort of a few years. So the results are yet to be seen, I have to say. But in that vein, let me go a little bit more on the specifics. For instance, on two mechanisms in the context of the USMCA. One of them is the one I previously mentioned. The long name is the Facility Specific Rapid Response Labor Mechanism, or as we call it, the Rapid Response Mechanism within the USMCA. That's basically what it does. It establishes a procedure to enforce freedom of association and collective bargaining, as well as other fundamental principles and rights at work between Mexico, United States, and Canada. The particularity of the RM, or the Rapid Response Mechanism, is that, or how it differs from other dispute resolution mechanisms, is that the trade sanctions or actions have a specific focus on companies' compliance and could be extended to the value chain of manufactured products. In addition, this mechanism is distinguished from other mechanisms by its speediness. It's quite fast, as it can resolve a dispute in approximately 4 months. Then again, most of them have been solved by social dialogue and other conciliatory measures, but still the mechanism is there. And I want to take also this opportunity to emphasize another mechanism within the USMCA, which is another long name, a mechanism for the restriction of imports with forced and child labor. This is even more recent than the entry into force of the USMCA, but it's unprecedented in the sense that it seeks to combat the trade of goods produced with forced and child labor through due diligence across the supply chains in North America. And by joining this mechanism, I think for Mexico is a way of reaffirming our commitment to the eradication of child labor, forced and compulsory labor in global supply chains, and to combating unfair competition practices that affect Mexican companies and productive dynamics in the North American region. It also places our country at the forefront of a new paradigm in foreign trade based on human rights, which is also something that has been discussed today a lot, and respect for the dignity of people, especially among historically disadvantaged sectors. And so these go hand in hand with our commitment of what I mentioned before, the application and the implementation of the 2019 labor reforms in Mexico. And it takes a lot from us, but in a good way. It's innovative nature also brings a lot of challenge in terms of responding to these mechanisms, because we need to have constant coordination with our trading partners, other federal governments, agencies. Many countries are a federal country, are very well aware of the challenges of coordinating at all levels with companies, with trade unions, and also always in the back of our minds is that these efforts and participating actively in these mechanisms are also aligned with other international and regional commitments on these issues. In particular, the last one, I can name one that is very known here in the ILO, the Alliance 8.7, to achieve SDG 8. But in general, we're trying to align what we do at the regional level, at the global level, and also how it has a huge impact at the national level.
Thank you. Thank you. Richard, let me turn to you. From what you were saying earlier, the rules of the current trade game have been very much shaped by those with investment capital, mostly those from the developed countries. Do you think that if we could get the voices of the developing countries more engaged in shaping the international trade scene, that would help? And is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the answer is, I think, yes. You know, Voltaire famously said that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy. It wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. And you can say much the same thing about free trade agreements. They're not about freedom. They were about tying the hands of governments. They were not really about trade. When you look at the multiple issues that have been stuffed into trade agreements, regulation at home, intellectual property, I mean, a whole slew of non-trade issues. And they're not really agreements in the sense that a huge amount of economic muscle and political muscle has been put into corralling a lot of developing countries into both free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties of one kind or another. So you know, I mean, those in that sense, the need for developing countries to offer a stronger voice on issues of relevance to them in shaping the rules of the game, I think, is imperative. We saw that in the COVID crisis. The main problem developing countries had in terms of access to vaccines was the TRIPS agreement, and the huge reluctance. Biden administration was one that actually said it was willing to relax the rules, but European countries with large pharmaceutical companies refused to do so, and there was no movement on the vaccine question, which was the major threat to developing countries there. So we have a series of rules that are clearly stacked against developing countries. On top of that, you have the problem of the investor-state dispute mechanisms that clearly are, and developing countries have suffered significantly under the findings of those that are clearly stacked in favor of capital. I don't think a trade union has taken any country to task in terms of using the ISDS to advance their cause, because it's not designed to do so. I mean, clearly it's not designed to do so. And so, I mean, you're going to have to, and so the rules are not working. Fortunately, developing countries are beginning to voice their, to put their voice forward, particularly in the WTO. The Africa Group, along with some other developing countries, has recently put industrial policy back on the table. And I think many of the problems, I think, as you've heard, can only be solved through more active industrial policies. The US has already started to employ industrial policies. A lot of other advanced economies are already doing so under various guises, but developing countries feel that you need to change the rules to be able to give them the room to implement those. And there's a push in that direction. At the same time, you have increasing South-South cooperation South-South trade is now a significant part of the trading system. We have the rise of the BRICS, which at least we see as an important new development in the global economy. A lot of opportunities for rethinking the rules for both trade, finance, technological flows that I think are opened up by the expansion of those kinds of agreements. So there are opportunities, I think, for developing countries to voice their views on the asymmetric and biased nature of the trading rules, but we have a long way to go in terms of more development. I'm not sure what a human-centric view actually is, but I would like to see a development-centered trading system. It was promised at Doha, hasn't been delivered. So we need the voice of developing countries if we're going to get a fairer, more effective, more efficient trading system.
Right. Okay. So more efficient trading system, more voices being heard. Now, somebody, and I can't remember who it was, said one should never waste a good crisis, and a crisis is an opportunity. So, Yuval, sorry, is this an opportunity to reset the system, to actually kind of create some fairer rules of the game? I mean, it's difficult in WTO. Nobody knows it more than you, but is this an opportunity?
Thank you so much. The two things, I think, while being good friends with Richard, that's the great thing about panels, that you can be good friends behind a panel, but in front of the panel, I have to disagree with you, Richard, on some points. I think one of them is really trade has lifted billions of people out of poverty. And I think we need to recognize that the system works. Does it work perfectly? No. Does it mean that everybody has benefited from trade? Absolutely not. You know, more and more people that are poor in richer countries, and of course, sometimes growing number of poor people, in developing countries themselves. But having said that, where I agree with Richard is that we have still space to really change the rules of the game. That's also the talks about the Bridgetown Initiative by Prime Minister Motley, President Macron on the new financial architecture, and how we really build what DDG Drake mentioned, this policy coherence amongst international institutions. 35 years ago, if you looked at the global GDP shares and, developing and emerging economies accounted for 42%, whereas developed countries was around 58%. That has inverted now. And I think no single group of countries can really claim, the majority of those sort of GDP across the world. So that means that you will see, I think, increasingly number of countries being wooed for joining free trade agreements, etc. And I think there's a role to precisely play so that the rules are fairer and more inclusive. And I think at the WTO, yes, there are good strands of showing that sustainability is the way forward. At our recent 12th ministerial 2 years ago, WTO members agreed to put an agreement to eliminate the $22 billion of illicit, illegal, and unreported fishing, where we could potentially use that money for more sustainable practices. That's fisheries, SDG 14.6, and that's the first sustainable agreement of the WTO. We could see something similar down the road on digital trade, on inclusion. Our next World Trade Report is going to be on inclusion. In a few days, trade and climate, we're going to be putting a sort of series of policy options for countries, developed and developing, to either use or reusing to decarbonize and build greater sustainability. So I think the future is bright in many ways for us to use the system to either propel it to greater heights, to make it more inclusive, more sustainable, really put people at the center. And I think with DG Drake, DG Hongbo, Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Rebecca Greenspan, Pamela Coke, etc. Hamilton, we have quite a lot of international leaders in the system, DG Ellard, to really push this agenda with members, of course. We've got also the IFD on investment facilitation for development, an agreement that will be adopted and hopefully, and also that's really put forward by developing countries. So all to say that, the next 7 years left before we reach the SDGs, SDG 8 and others, clearly there's an opportunity for us to accelerate some of those changes. As Richard also mentioned, When you look at the IFIs, surely there's quite a lot to be done. When I was working at the World Bank, a lot of the conversations were around, how will the African chair get an additional chair? It's great that now the AU has a chair at the G20, but is that enough? Absolutely not. When you look at all the potential for critical minerals, for renewable energy, for the ocean economy, developing countries really have a huge opportunity. But talk to any peer in developing countries. A lot of students, a lot of youngsters are looking for jobs. They want to move, they want to get out. And so that's why I think what we're doing at the ILO is so fundamental, and the WTO as well, for us to really get those policies, those lessons together. And I think if we do it right, I really sincerely think the opportunities to put more people in the planet at the center of trade agreements in the future is really there. It's not impossible, and it just requires members with what also I think with what Jane, but also Sonia said, that you're going to need all these multi-stakeholders to really come together. And I think that's where we're going.
Thanks. Okay, we literally only have a couple of minutes left, but I must give the final words to our social partners, employers and workers. And Sonia, let me come back to you. There's a lot of change going on in the international system, including the trade system. Can you give us one or two things that you would like to see come out of this from the employer's perspective?
Definitely communication. Opening the channels of communication is important, and I thank my colleague Yvonne from the WTO that mentioned this. We are hosting in February 25th, 2024, a very high-level delegation bringing together, hopefully, and I urge you, please, if you can join us, WTO, ILO, ministers of labor in the region, in the Gulf. And the idea is to basically amplify the voice and the impact of the employers and business organizations, and create that trade policy landscape where we bring everybody together at one forum and put that landscape jointly together. And we sincerely hope that WTO will have a presence in this event, because this, without WTO, it will be missing a link. And as you rightly said, we need to change the rule of the game, but we need to change it jointly, and individually we cannot do it. And this is why it's very important to have at such events happening, but also to have the presence of all the constituents there to ensure that everybody has the right to be involved and to speak clearly about their opinion. But basically, looking ahead, our focus will be on strengthening these ties between trade policies, labor market institutions, and of course, employers' organizations. And we must be agile, we must be proactive, we must collaborate, and we must adapt to this ever-changing global landscape. And the journey towards sustainable development is a marathon. It's not a sprint, but a marathon. It depends primarily on persistence, depends on innovation, and above all, collaboration. And if we don't collaborate and work together, it's going to be very difficult to have these policies effectively supporting the SDGs and what we aim at. And as leaders in the business world, our role is pivotal, not just in shaping policies, but in foregoing a future that is equitable, it is inclusive, and above all, sustainable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Alison, a final word to you. Don't waste a good crisis. What would be top of the ITUC's wish list in terms of change?
There's a few things. We would really urge greater cooperation between the ILO and the WTO. So, Mava, I thank you for your work and that of your team, and also to the authors for this work. The Trade Policy Review Mechanism should monitor and consider labour standards violations with the participation of workers' organisations. The Aid for Trade whole context should secure resources to fully cover adjustment costs, and things like skills development for workers affected by trade liberalisation. In our view, the GATT and GATS must already be read to protect fundamental labour rights. So as such, for greater certainty, we would really urge the WTO to pursue an authoritative interpretation. What I mean here is that the WTO could affirmatively protect fundamental labour rights without the need for any new instruments or amendments to existing ones. Already the Marrakesh Agreement was referenced. Further, an authoritative interpretation does not require consensus, thus avoiding the veto by any one member state. We think that the coherence of public policy is what is needed now. We are in a global polycrisis, as has been addressed earlier, and we need all actors to be taking these issues really seriously. So this seminar, reframing that trade and decent work are interlinked and need to have all the institutional resources that we have at our disposal to address this, and the social partners stand ready to play our role. Thank you.
Alison, thank you very much. And most unfortunately, we are already over time, so I don't think we are going to be able to include questions. My apologies for that, but I would like very much to thank our panelists, Alison Tate and Soya Janahi, who are both online, Yuvan Bejaher from the WTO, Sara Gabriela Luna Camacho from the Permanent Mission of Mexico, Celeste Drake from the ILO, Richard Kozul-Wright from UNCTAD, and Jane Nalunga from Siatini. Thank you all very much for your contributions. And just as a final thing, I would like to give the floor very briefly to Richard Samans, the head of ILO Research, for a quick set of concluding remarks. Richard, please do speak from there. Don't bother to come up to the panel.
Yeah, I think pithiness would be the way to go here. And the best and most important message to provide here is twofold. One, congratulations to the team and to all the partners who mobilized this work. This is an ongoing process to provide better tools to be able to advance progress toward the objective of much broader progress in living standards and people's material well-being as part of the growth process, including but not limited to trade measures on the one hand. And the second message is to thank not only the governor of Flanders for having the foresight to support the work, but to all of our partners who here participated in this event. I think it was an excellent way to launch this new phase of analytical material, and we hope that it gets picked up and is deemed to be useful. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and we look forward to cooperating in the future.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much to the team who organized this event, which took a lot of work. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it informative. So thank you and good evening.